Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Lisa Polisane. I am the Education and Community Engagement Manager here at Ulite Arts. And I'm so glad to have you all with me here for session 2 of Skills Artist Toolbox 101. And today we'll be talking about writing work descriptions and project descriptions. And if you didn't attend the first one, you didn't see this intro, but this program kind of came about after we did our How to Apply program last year and realized how much need there was for more understanding around this kind of more basic level education on working as a visual artist. I'm really, really thankful and pleased to have Alpesh Patel and Christy Gast here with me today. They're two people I've known for a significant amount of time and I've seen them along the way as an artist and building myself up to this point. Christy Gast is an artist whose work has been exhibited nationally. She collaborates with a collective research program, Ensayos, on ecologically focused interdisciplinary projects encompassing art, science, and ethics. She is also on the faculty at Nomad MFA program at the University of Hartford Art School. And Alpesh Patel is Associate Professor of Contemporary Art and Theory at Florida International University. He is an art historian whose work focuses on his queer, anti-racist, and transnational approach to contemporary art. He has a PhD from the University of Manchester and a BA in history from Yale. So I'm pleased to have Christy and Alpesh join me now on the virtual stage.
Hi. Hi, Michelle. Thank you. And hello to all the attendees.
Hello, everyone.
Y'all want to add anything to your bios?
No.
Thank you.
So we can go ahead and get started on the presentation. Get that to full screen. Okay. Wait, hold on. Oh, that was strange. Hold on. Let's try that again. Share screen. And let's go into full screen. That's so strange.
It looks like you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, it disappears once I click share.
Lesson number 1, technology will always let you
Let me just do it this way instead, I guess. I'll put in full screen first. Let's try again. Okay, there we go. So weird. All right.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. So Alpesh, Michelle, and I have prepared this presentation based on our experience working with artists to prepare their statements. Alpesh as a art history professor, and myself as somebody who, in addition to being an artist, works behind the scenes as a grant writer. So I support artists and organizations. So I think Alpesh is going to lead with this slide.
Yeah, I think that we wanted to start with this idea that all these applications are a form of networking. Whether or not you get a particular grant, you're going to be seen by the jurists. So often when I'm juring things, I get to find out about all these artists. Maybe one or two only get the grant, but now I know about all these other different artists I didn't know before. I've had experiences where I haven't gotten a job, but people that I met at that place where I didn't get the job worked with me in another capacity later. So I guess it's that kind of thinking that we wanted to open up with, that think of this as a networking, you're getting your voice out. And these three things are things we thought were really important to stress overall, right? To be authentic, grounded, and generous, and to trust your instincts.
That's right. And so in terms of being authentic, grounded, and generous, be authentic to who you are as an artist. Don't try to it's not a good idea to use an application to stretch your ideas so far that you don't recognize them anymore as coming from sort of the core of who you are. Make sure that your writing is grounded in the questions that are actually being asked in the application, and grounded in what you can show that you've done as an artist, and how that foundation will allow you to grow. And be generous with your words and ideas. Don't make the panelists do a lot of extra guesswork or extra legwork to really get to the core of what you're trying to say. And ultimately, just trust your instincts.
Yeah. I will speak to just like this, when you can kind of see when an artist is trying to stretch their work or trying to do more than they should. It's very obvious when you're reading through the applications from time to time too. Just wanted to add that.
So we came up with some do's and don'ts that are based on our experiences reviewing and working with artists to develop writing, and also as artists writing about our own work. So do think about your audience and their understanding of the context of your work. Sometimes an audience is going to be really at your level. They're going to be your peers. They're going to be curators who are really engaged with the ideas that you care about. And sometimes they might not. It might be an audience of community members who don't have an art education background. So you want to write to meet them at their level as best as you can. So that's part of this generosity idea. Start with the most interesting, the most important idea. You don't have to do a lot of sort of wordy lead up trying to convince people that your ideas are legitimate. Just start with the core of what you care about. Be direct, be accurate, and that just has to do with choosing your words carefully and not repeating yourself. You can save a lot on word count by not repeating yourself. Lean on your art and art history references. The people on these panels love art and care about art and want to know how you see yourself fitting into the big story, the big questions. When bring in your other cultural references when those are relevant. So your cultural history, the subcultures that are important to you are definitely going to have an impact on the kind of work that you do, and are going to be really authentic to who you are as a person and as an artist. And those are as valid as the art and art history references, but more on that later as well. So describe, when you're talking about the image, describe what's in it and how you made it. Help the people who are looking at your work understand what they're seeing. Paint a picture for them in your words, so that when they see the images, they really understand what they're looking at. And use all of the allotted space. If you have 100 words to describe something, don't settle for 10 words. See what you can see, how much deeper you can go into your work, your ideas, your art and art history references, your cultural references, to really paint a super clear, holistic picture for the person who's reviewing your application.
And in terms of the don'ts, and just to sort of pivot off the last point, when I read an application and all the allotted space isn't used, it makes it feel like this person maybe didn't spend a lot of time on the application. That might not be the case, but so you want to really fill that space up. Right, so a couple of don'ts. So we'll animate all these points. So we're just listing them now, and then we'll animate them. Don't use too much jargon. It's really easy, especially in the art world, to end up using words that feel like everyone probably knows what it means, like discourse, let's say. But you want to avoid as much as possible using any kind of language that isn't super simple, to put it, I guess, to put a fine point on it. So try to stay away from those words that require a little bit of context to really understand. You may not have that room to do that. You don't want to get overly personal, especially if it isn't relevant to the idea. And that's the key part. If there's an aspect of who you are that is connected to your practice, then it makes sense to link those together, and that's very nice. But when we can't see a connection, it kind of is irrelevant then, and perhaps doesn't need to be there in this small amount of space that you have to tell everyone about your work. Talk about what isn't there or visible in the work. This is your chance, right, to talk about those things that maybe you can't see right away in the work. And it's your opportunity to kind of fill in the blanks for those viewing and looking at your application. Don't use passive voice. This is an important one in the sense you want everything to be very active. It needs to feel confident. And when you use passive voice, it doesn't project that kind of confidence. So that's something to definitely work on, rework your sentences if necessary. And of course, stay away from superlatives or fluffy or floral language. I think anytime you want to say something is the best or the worst, or you want to stay away from those kinds of extremes in some way. So keep your kind of, I think, writing somewhere in between those poles, you could say. And the fluffy floral language, I think, is just something that when you're anxious in writing, you might end up having a lot of words that help relax yourself as you're beginning to type, but that probably don't need to be there in the final draft. They're kind of like filler. So stay away from that filler language that doesn't really give us much in terms of content. And this means even like a, and the, those kinds of things as well.
Yeah, I definitely feel like also that particular kind of language can kind of just make the thought get lost within it, because there's so much around it surrounding the actual thought that you kind of forget what you're even trying to get to at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I was answering a question, but I accidentally answered it to the panelists. So maybe somebody could share that with the attendees.
Okay.
Passive voice. So yes, getting right into the examples. So we have 3 case studies to present to you. The first is an artist statement, and it was sort of funny when we were selecting the examples to share with you, that it was kind of hard to come up with some bad examples. So for this one, we used a bot, actually. It's called Artie Bollocks, and it will produce goofy artist statements for you if you so desire. So the task was to take this Artie Bollocks artist statement that does everything wrong, ineffective, and help it do some things right. So the ineffective version is here on the left. My work explores the relationship between gender politics and counterterrorism. With influences as diverse as Nietzsche and John Lennon, new variations are crafted from both orderly and random structures. Ever since I was a student, I have been fascinated by the essential unreality of the zeitgeist. What starts out as a contemplation soon becomes corrupted into a manifesto of futility, leaving only a sense of chaos and the unlikelihood of a new synthesis. As shimmering replicas become transformed through diligent and repetitive practice, the viewer is left with an epitaph for the possibilities of our existence. Does that give you a picture of what the art is that the artist does? Not really. So this statement is ineffective because it's full of jargon. For example, the zeitgeist, gender politics and counterterrorism, those things do have philosophical, historical, art historical, political references, but those references aren't apparent in what the work is. The big ideas are not supported by any specific details, so it sounds insincere. So we want to have evidence of the claims being made. For example, what starts out as a contemplation soon becomes corrupted into a manifesto of futility, leaving only a sense of chaos and the unlikelihood of new synthesis. How? By doing what? With what kind of art materials or what kind of tactics? Hyperbolic empty phrases. phrases that essentially don't really say anything, even though they use a lot of words, like the essential unreality of the zeitgeist, or gender politics and counterterrorism. It, like, I can kind of imagine what those mean in a far off way, but not grounded to this artist's work, because I don't even know what medium they work in. The description doesn't leave you with an artist of what with an image of what the artist makes, in other words. So in that sense, it's a poor use of the space allotted. It uses a lot of words to say ideas that are sort of floating in the ether, but not connected to the artist, who they are, or what their work is. And same with the historical references. So if we go to the next slide, I think that I'll just give you a couple of minutes to read this. It's a more effective example that we rewrote. So Michelle, I think you can move on to the next slide. And everybody, if you haven't finished, we're going to go into each section in detail. So for the first paragraph, in this paragraph, you're sort of, in this case, the artist is sort of setting up who they are, where they're from, what they care about. They did that by putting out these really big ideas that they're interested in: gender politics and counterterrorism, the influences of Misha and John Lennon. So in the new paragraph, it's really grounded to their biography and what they studied and why those things are important. So it has to do with being trained in photography and doing something with their life that's sort of different than what other artists have done by being part of the National Guard. So that kind of leads into this story of the gender politics and counterterrorism. It's a more specific description of the artist's background and experiences. So in that sense, it's grounded. It tells a surprising story. It makes you wonder how the story, the biography, and the artist's background relates to the art practice. It gives clear examples of why counterterrorism, for example, is important to this person. And it sets up the next paragraph to deal with the question of why gender politics is important. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next paragraph. So in the next paragraph, they go deeper into the art and art history and cultural references that influence their work and tell why. So it gives a deeper description of what this artist's complex artwork deals with. Those examples are grounded in art history: the Claude Cahun, the photographer Omar Fast, the video installation artist. And those really connect back to this artist's biography. And it makes the references very relevant to the work and more plausible. It's helpful to use quotes. So there's a quote about Omar Fast's work that does a good job of explaining what it is. And it all points back to the artist's work. So we're left thinking about the artist's work and not the reference. We don't sort of get shoved off the page in a whole new train of thought. So let's take a look at the final paragraph. The final paragraph tells us what the artwork looks like and how it's made and how it connects to those ideas in the biography and in the art and art history and cultural references. So it's an actual description of the work that hopefully you can visualize if you close your eyes, even without the artwork being in front of you. So that's the liminal spaces of conflict zones. So the specific examples are pockmarked fragments of buildings and roads that's shot with the iPhone, and the altered bodies of queer friends in the military, close-ups of their tattoos, and scars, and then those are printed in black and white on aluminum, and the aluminum is crumpled. So you really get a picture of what this artwork might look like, almost the size of it, what it would feel like to be around it. And then, and it all links back to who this artist is. So their biography has a specific connection to the work. So that, yeah, sums up the example of the artist statement, I think.
Okay, for our second case study, we're looking at project descriptions. And actually, instead of sort of breaking it down and reworking it, we've just provided you actually with a statement that we think really works very well. So we take a second or two to look at this, and I'll kind of, Christy will go back and forth to kind of highlight, what makes this a really strong project description.
So do you want to go to the next slide? I think it's got some bullet points in it that we can refer to. So first of all, I want to say that we pulled this off of the Harpo Foundation's website. So this person received an individual artist grant from the Harpo Foundation. They made it through the jury selection process and came out on the other side with the award. And this is what was published on the Harpo Foundation's website. It's a great opportunity for artists if you're not aware of it. So this artist answers, she says a lot in the first sentence, and then the subsequent details in the paragraph relate back to that first sentence. So indigenous to Peru and adopted into a working class transracial family, Tara Krajnak is a photo-based artist whose early experience established her ongoing artistic preoccupation with forgotten landscapes, orphanhood, exile, race, origins, and the way these constructs are written on the body and in the archive. There's really a lot there. And without that, that biographical information in the beginning, that list of what she's interested in would just be floating without a grounded connection. So it's really, this first sentence really does a lot.
It's a really fantastic first sentence. It really also gets you excited to read more, but it does a lot of work. The second point here is the use of art circle references, and that the audience most likely will understand. And what I think that what this person has done, which is great, is that she brings up, for instance, Ansel Adam, but she doesn't assume actually that that he's a photographer. She does give us a little bit more detail about Ansel Adams so that it's clear the context within which she is looking at that particular artist. So I think that's the strength of in here when she brings that up. She mentions later Anamadiata, artist Anamadiata, native poet Natalie Diaz. There's not as much information there, but it almost feels like it's okay that that's not there, given the kind of the depth within which she went in that second section of actually exploring Ansel Adam. And also just, this project description really frames this within the history of art and the conversations happening. So the sentence, her current project explores the modernist canon within the history of landscape photography, one that's deeply rooted in colonial expansionism and indigenous genocide. She's, that's kind of a broad context within which she wants us to see the work, but she's telling us that she's also aware that these kinds of dialogues are taking place.
Yeah, that's right. And she, what strikes me is the way that she starts by referencing Ansel Adams' work, but what she says is that she does something that's a little different and goes beyond what Ansel Adams did, because her take on the modernist canon of landscape photography is deeply rooted in colonial expansionism and indigenous genocide. And when she talks about the other two artists whose work she's interested in, she makes sure to state that Natalie Diaz is a native poet, because she's because these ideas of indigeneity and colonialism are important to her and linked to her work. So that in that sense, she relates to the relevant information about her personal life, but she doesn't need to go into a lot of detail about her personal circumstances. It's just that this is a part of her biography that formed her intellectual interests.
And there's really a lack of jargon or fluffy language. If you go through this, there are just really strong descriptions, nouns. Everything has its place. Every word feels like it was carefully thought of. Even when she describes, how she's using body, hair, and hands to critique Adam's work, there's specificity that can, avoids the potential of, for instance, her comment earlier that I mentioned about Marna's, about how she's exploring the Marna's canon within the history of landscape photography. That could, kind of go nowhere, but she grounds it in very specific language later. So it avoids that from becoming just empty language that doesn't really go anywhere for us.
That's right. And her description of her artwork, she says that she uses Adam's iconic work, but she inserts her own photographs over the top. So we get the sense of some sort of element of collage. She uses her own body, hair, and hands to redact his words, to erase his photographs, so we can picture what that is going to look like in her work too. So she gives a really good description, and she uses a very active, present voice to say what she does. I do, I make, I move, I cover. So in that sense, it's really easy to follow, and it's authentic to everything that she wrote in the first sentence. It's grounded in everything she wrote in that first sentence, and it's generous in her descriptions of why it's connected to the work of other artists and what she does. Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so this third case study is looking at work descriptions, and this is a description as an answer to a question about an artist's work for the Chautauqua School of Art summer program application. It's slightly reworked, and I'm thankful to the person who originally kind of wrote this, that providing this for us here. But if you want to quickly just kind of look through it now for a second, and then I'll kind of go through it in detail, like sentence by sentence, to tell you what I'm thinking about when I'm going through this after each sentence. As you go through this, I think by the end, one thing is you just don't really get a sense of what the work actually looks like. It still feels opaque. Despite all these words that have been used, it's not quite there yet. So we can go to the next slide, and we can go through these different sentences. So I pulled out like almost every sentence, and just describe what I'm thinking as I'm reading this. And so this first sentence, which is the most important one, right? It's the one that's supposed to hook you in. You shouldn't have questions in it for your reader. I'm currently working on a series of paintings that are about exploring the tensions embodied in experiences of the 2D and 3D, drawing from imaginative and real space. It just felt way too broad. And these ideas of the imaginative and the real also need maybe a little bit further definition. So those are the kinds of things I was thinking about right away. This second point, meaning can be gleaned from the use of figurative and anthropomorphic language. Tell me what those meanings are. Give me a sense of what those meanings that are gleaned from the language that are used, and maybe also tell me what kind of anthropomorphic language you're using instead of using that term anthropomorphic. Just to kind of ground it a little bit more, I think. The fourth one, I intentionally use references from the changing vernacular architecture. So here I'm wanting more details. It's still feeling very kind of vague and not specific enough. Or 5, recently the idea of inflating. Here, I ask, is this literal? And I'm really going through this how I would normally assess someone's like description and what kinds of things I would be thinking of. And so far, I have a lot of questions that aren't being answered as I'm going through, which worries me. Number 6, images is related to my fascination with anti-clastic. So I actually, when I first read this, thought that maybe this was a typo. I mean, I had never come across this word. I then looked it up later, and it does have a definition, etc. It's not one that I've come across. So what would have been better here is if the definition were just used instead of the word anti-clastic, so that it's absolutely crystal clear. Given, even someone like me, right, that who should be aware of all kinds of terminology still isn't getting this. The 7th, using volume transforms flat shapes, creating a surface tension. This starts to feel very generic. Like I could see this as a description for a lot of different works. So again, I'm kind of looking for that specificity that doesn't seem to be emerging. Then something exciting happens in number 8, I feel like, when he talks about blowing and bending and floating and pumping. These are wonderful phrases. And, I want to know how those connect back to some of these ideas that he's brought up, whether it's the anti-clastic or the imaginative and real space, or the figurative and anthropomorphic language. Like, how do they come together? It's such a really evocative and very specific description that got me very excited. And in the last, just the last sentence there, I feel these elements come together with the use of color and texture found throughout the compositions, which I hope opens up space for the viewer to slip inside and be able to decode. You want to be assertive. You don't hope, you know that it does this. You want to be really super confident about how you express the work. You don't have to be shy. This is your time, in a way, to say, this is what my work does. It opens up a space for the viewer to slip inside and be able to decode. So I was missing that. It felt a little weak. So, having read all of this, I don't really feel like I know anything about this artist's work, to tell you the truth. It feels like a very much on the surface. The groundedness that we've talked about isn't there. The authenticity, it also is in question, because it feels somewhat potentially insincere. We're not getting a sense of how this really comes together for him as an artist in some way. And the generousness, it comes through in some places. I definitely think when he's talking about, blowing and bending and floating and pumping, it's there. But in other places, he kind of assumes that we know what, like, anti-clastic is. He put it in quotes, most likely to tell us that this is a terminology of some kind, but it doesn't tell us more about that. So you could use that word and then briefly contextualize it, or you can just get rid of the word and talk about what the definition actually is. Okay, this last case study actually is more something that we were not going to deconstruct here, but we wanted to provide for you to kind of think about at home. What you're looking at here is a description, a formal analysis of a work by Picasso that was done by a student of mine in my class last semester, who very nicely allowed me to use this. I kind of want to pair this with the next slide, where we have a description of that same work by the Museum of Modern Art. And maybe if you could just flip to that slide quickly, we can just show you that. Because it's a very well-known work, the one that he's looking at. So this is the description that the Museum of Modern Art gives for this very same work. I actually think it's not necessarily perfect either, but it's a great way of understanding how these statements that you make are always based in some kind of context, right? This is an institutional description, so it's going to talk a lot about MoMA and its role in this work. That's not something necessarily that you would need to do if you were just talking about the work, for instance. But go through this previous slide and kind of, and go through that list of, is there jargon, all those don'ts, where, what's working in it and what's not, to kind of understand, what needs more specificity.
So this is something I kind of pulled from Creative Capital's application. It came up a few times when we were working through this process, that we all kind of agreed that Creative Capital does a really great job of giving you questions that can help with writing these statements as well. And essentially, if you can answer all of these questions, you're kind of in a good place, right? So, it kind of starts off with like asking about the project. So it asks for project details, and says including final expected form that your project will likely take. And that's something really important to consider, because I think sometimes when we're working on projects and we're on the early stages of it, we kind of assume that what we're talking about answers like what the final product will look like. And sometimes it can be helpful to kind of work backwards by thinking about, this is what I want it to look like in the end, and this is where I am now, and this is what I'm going to do to get there. Um, so how does your product take on an original and imaginative approach to context and form? Which, that's obviously an important thing to consider when you're putting yourself in this kind of pool, especially with Creative Capital of thousands of people. How do you make sure that your project stands out, and doesn't kind of repeat the same things that others have done, or takes things that others have done and takes it to another level? What kind of impact, artistic, creative, intellectual, communal, civic, social, etc., do you hope your project will have? And what strategies will you employ to achieve the desired impact? Now, this is definitely much more specific to the Creative Capital application, because that program is meant to have some kind of engagement aspect. But if you're an artist who does engagement, or has some kind of focus in engagement, it is important to try to answer that question either for yourself or with your description, so that when you write your descriptions, you are more aware of where that comes from. Who are specific audiences and communities that you hope to engage? It's kind of similar to the last question, but in this instance, it's about the actual audience itself, which you should be aware of. And same to the same thought that we had in the beginning, where we were talking about when writing your descriptions, thinking about the audience and who you're speaking to. In this instance, if you can identify your audience, you'll do a great job of writing a description or creating a project that answers to that audience. And so, yeah, of course, think beyond the broad art community. And this is obviously another part that's specific to, say, Creative Capital or other grant applications that are more community and engagement centered. But if you are focusing on those issues, it is important to think about that. So how might your proposed project act as a catalyst for your artistic and professional growth? Now, your project descriptions won't have to always answer this kind of question, but it can be helpful to know where that comes from, or what desires you have for this to change your practice. Or in cases where you're applying for, say, a grant that's bigger than anything you've ever gotten before, this can be a good way to kind of gauge your need and how this will change your practice, and how it's pivotal to your practice. And then, what are the main influences on your work as an artist? How does your past work inform your current work? Use concrete examples. So these can kind of be jumbled into one nice sentence or to a couple of very nice sentences, but knowing where your influences come from can always be helpful for the reader. As we mentioned earlier, when we kind of analyzed the Claude Calhoun and John Lennon, Omar Fast, and why that artist who makes this particular work might have an influence from that person. So that's kind of, I think, you looking at an application like Creative Capital's and kind of reading through how they answer, even if you're not applying to that, can really be helpful to help you with writing these descriptions.
And then there's something I wanted to add to that, which is that in this specific application, you have about three sentences worth of words to answer each of these. So you don't want to repeat yourself. If you you want to find a way to refer back to your important issues that you're dealing with without using the same words or phrases over and over. So that is really important specifically for this one, since they're such short answers to address different aspects of your project.
Yeah, and it can even be kind of like a practice for yourself to just run through these questions and try to answer them, each one of them differently, or to ensure that you're not repeating the same phrases or sentences. Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to also add that writing is ultimately about communication.
Mhm.
And you want to make sure that what you think you're communicating is actually getting across. So that means you always have to bring someone in, a friend, someone. If you're just doing this at home by yourself alone and you send it off, it's a risk. Because we have blind spots. We can't often see what isn't there. But if we give it to a friend, they might be able to say, well, I'm not getting that if that's what you were attempting to do, or this is what I'm getting out of it, and I'm not getting these things. So everything that I write, I workshop with friends. It's a social experience. Like, it's not something that's completely singular. And I just wanted to make that clear. Like, this doesn't have to feel like something you do on your own at all. Like, it very much is about, again, communication, because that's what writing really is. So make sure that what you are thinking is, again, getting communicated is actually getting across in that way, by bringing other people in to look at what you're writing, your answers, your narratives, for instance.
This kind of leads us into, oh,
Questions?
oh. Yeah, we can go into the questions. So I'm gonna, yeah, there we go. So I guess we can look down into this Q&A. Oh. So at this point, I guess we can open it up, and if anybody had any specific questions that they wanted to ask of any of our speakers, we can go ahead and ask those questions now. There was one question that you said that you had earlier about passive voice.
Oh yeah, I put the answer in the chat. So passive voice means that you're using a sentence construction where the thing that's doing the action is placed at the end and the object. So the example was bananas are adored by monkeys. That would be passive voice as opposed to the active voice, which is monkeys adore bananas, which is easier to process on the receiving end, especially when you are dealing with very short word counts.
Okay. So there's a question here that says, sorry, let me read that. So why would one use the pronoun her and not I in the?
I can answer that one. I think that's because this was an example that was pulled from work descriptions that were put out by the institution that funded the artist. So while she might have written it in first person when she submitted it, it makes more sense when the organization puts it out into the world to say whose work they funded to use the third person.
And then, so we have a question from Juan, and it says, how could one approach questions and grants like, who are specific audiences / who are you reaching out to? Who are you reaching out to with you? Will you / what outreach will your work have? For example, you're looking for funding for a project, but not sure where the work will be presented for, don't have a place to exhibit it yet.
You can only traffic in the details you know. I think that's the important thing. If you don't know, you don't know. And unless you want to speculate and provide that information, I think that you just, always just ground it in what is tangible and real if you can, for the most part.
And if there's a grant that has a question that is really important to the funders that you can't answer, that might tell you that it's not a great fit for your proposal and that you're not necessarily going to be as competitive as somebody else. But if your intention is to work with, let's say, an artist run space, or that if you want to use the grant funding to be able to propel you to the point where you can make those introductions to get your work shown to the Miami art community, or make sure that the queer community that's featured in the work gets to see it, then that's something that you can say, and you don't always have to know the way the work is going to finally evolve when you're writing a proposal, but you should be thinking down the road.
Yeah. So with work descriptions, do you think it's stronger to start with describing exactly what we see, physical description, or what the work is about, conceptual description?
You know, it could go either way. I guess I would say that maybe in the first two sentences, if they both talk about the concept and detail the work, that's fantastic. You've got like some very nice stuff going right away. So it's hard to give like a hard and fast answer about which one is more important.
I think like in most instances, it's kind of depends, right? Like depends on what can give you the strongest introduction to the project. If your project is kind of like a minimal, visually quite minimal, it might not be the first thing you want to start with because it's not striking, right? But maybe the conceptual ideas can kind of punch in that. I think back to the project description we saw from the Harpo Foundation. That description, the intro, got us all very excited. We read it and then we all were started Googling this artist immediately together. We're all just like, oh wow, her work is so cool. And we realized that we were all doing the same thing. And that just meant the description was so good that it got us all very excited very quickly. So it really just depends on the project itself.
Yeah, I like what Alpesh said about if you can do it in the first two sentences. And I'm thinking about what Michelle said about if your work is visually quite minimal, you might say something like, my work is visually quite minimal. It's a representation of the sound waves of mosquitoes that are carrying Zika virus.
Yeah.
But what I'm looking at is something that's visually minimal. I want to know what's in it. It's these little squiggles. What are they?
Yeah, that's great. That's came up with that very quickly too. So would first or third person artist bio be better on the artist's own site? It kind of, it's kind of up to you, but I feel like typically it's usually third person, and I feel like it's just become this kind of standard. It also just makes it easier when you're sharing it, because typically the organizations are going to change it to third person anyway. So if you send them something that's third person, it kind of answers all the questions. And the truth is, it says the same thing. It just, the perspective is one or the other. So I personally do think third person is just the smartest way to go about it. So you're not having to rewrite things when you're asked for it. And some organizations will ask you to rewrite it in third person also. So, oh, but the same question again. And I feel like there was another one here. Let me see. Oh, no, I think I got everything. If anybody has any more questions, we have a little bit more time if you want to go over those to put any more in here. But
add a little bit more to that last question actually too. If there's something going on your website and let's say that statement you want to have in third person, so it's something easily sort of sent to lots of different places, have another tab or something where you do, kind of use the word I if you feel like it's important or necessary. Because personally, I feel like those things are meant for, they're not really meant for your artist's website, right? They're meant for someone else, the third person. So that's kind of a something you manufacture for someone else. But for yourself, if you have a website, you might want to, I think, accompany that with something that does have the word I in it, that's looser perhaps, and is a foil then for the more sort of clinical third person statement that you're going to need to have, as Michelle and Christy mentioned.
Most artists keep files of both.
Yeah. Another question we got is, should your work or project descriptions change depending on if it's on your website or if it's in a grant application?
Totally. Great question. So Often with a grant application, 100% your project description is going to be answering the questions that they ask. So it's never really possible to copy and paste exactly from one application to another. You always are going to rewrite because the question, it has a little bit of a different angle or a different word count. And the, yeah, so the answer is definitely, and you are trying to get that funding. So you want to put your story in words that the funder can hear. And that takes some adaptation.
Yeah, and it also it can be really helpful to kind of have to revisit that writing every once in a while that you've written for those applications. So kind of uh so kind of using it as like an exercise for yourself to like have to revisit that work. And I also wanted to just say like something that came up also for us was just thinking of like practical things like you should be running these things through like a word processor. You shouldn't the the worst thing you can do for your application is to directly type everything into whatever form they're using. Like, don't directly type it into submittable because although your Google might have some kind of word spell check, it might not have like a grammar check. And using something like Google Docs or Microsoft Word or something like that, and like I like to copy paste the entire application into a Google Doc, answer all those questions, and then share with like 5 people. And another tip that I remember that came up with us in this conversation was reading it out loud also to yourself. Because if you stumble over your words, even though you wrote the words, the reader who doesn't know you at all will also stumble over those words. And sometimes we're typing and it feels really fluid, and then we try to say it out loud and it's like, wow, what is this mess, you know? And something I personally do with my collaborators a lot is we'll just like turn on the Google Voice type option on Google Docs, and we'll just kind of talk about the project, because sometimes, for me at least, I find that being able to just say it can help me kind of inform the writing. And so like certain words will pop up a lot, or certain phrases will pop up a lot, or visual descriptions as well. Oh, we just got 5 more questions in the chat. Um, so how can you find out who the audience is, i.e. the jurors, beforehand?
Not always possible.
Yeah.
But usually they'll say who last year's jurors were, and you can look through and say, oh, okay, they had a museum curator, a person from this community organization, an artist who got the grant last year, and somebody from the staff. So that's probably who you're going to be talking to this year.
And for the Chautauqua summer school residency that I mentioned, I'm going to be jurying that, and there's other people that will be jurying. It's all very visible on the website, like who the people are that are going to be looking at your application. And in fact, one of the questions in the application is, who would you like to work with? The jurists are also the mentors for that residency. So sometimes information is there, which is helpful, and other times it's opaque and it's not so clear. And that's when you really want to be careful with your language. That is to say that like, again, the jargon, like you got to assume, people know practically nothing. I mean, that's kind of how I try to write. I don't know if that's in the end what happens. I'm sure I'm using jargon, but you want to be use as simple language as possible.
Yeah, and sometimes I think also to kind of to piggyback off of like the simple language, sometimes I like to write things like, especially for like exhibition proposals or installation proposals, I write it as if I'm walking through the space. So kind of like I start with like just saying like, what will I interact with when I walk into the space, or what will the person see and experience, so that I can so I can think, if I can visualize that myself, I read it out loud, I share it with people, and it's like, when you read this, what do you see? Or what comes to your mind? And that can be pretty helpful as well.
Another thing I want to say is the people on the panel, they don't want to knock you out of the running. They want to help you get the award, but you have to help them, and you can help them by only submitting what is asked of you and doing a really good job at it. Don't throw in extra superfluous things that are not asked for, but make sure that you do submit exactly everything that is asked for. Because if you don't, they won't be able to forward you to the next part of the process, and they want to.
Yeah.
That's
So
actually a really good point. Yeah, I mean, last summer when, or last spring, when we were looking at these Chautauqua School of Art applications, uh, you know, like Christy says, we're not interested in throwing people out. We want reasons to bring people in. And so there was this one application that was really, really cool. The artworks looked interesting, but the answers were 1 or 2 sentences. And
Mhm.
it just left us wanting more. It's like, oh, use that space, tell us a little bit more. And because we didn't know, we can't manufacture
Mhm.
what's not there.
Right.
So, and that, that affected her ranking in the system. So it is sometimes just following the directions that are given to you that's so crucial.
And something like that, where you're being invited to be part of a community, if you're not giving, if you're not generous with your words, if you're not sharing information, then it's going to be questionable if you're going to be a good part of a community or a good
Mhm.
contributing member of a community.
And yeah, to piggyback off of what Alpesh said about manufacturing, you never want anyone to have to kind of read between the lines of what you've written. You want what you write to be so descriptive that they see exactly what it is. And it's really unfortunate because if in that case right there, you can see directly how someone's application was negatively affected by them not putting in enough words. And you don't want to just create this scenario where you're just like rewriting the same sentence, but make sure you're adding as much detail as possible. There's a question that says, do you have any advice on how to write the timeline for the project? This is related to creative capital. How specific should you be? And so, because creative capital specifically asks for discernible beginning, middle, and end. And so they're asking like how to do that
With
best.
that application, there are 4 ways you tell your story. You tell your story by answering questions, you tell your story with your images, you tell your story with the timeline, and you tell your story with the budget. They should all tell the same story.
Yes.
So you say that you want to do like an exhibition that has a performance component with community workshops, then talk about in the months of however many years, or in the quarters of however many years, depends on how you want to do it. Like, make it really easy to follow. January, February, um, packing and shipping the work. March, April, working on the publication with the people, and make sure that anything that is stated in the budget that you want to use their money to pay for, say when you're going to do it in the timeline.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has to be so specific. And I struggle with this myself when I apply for grants and they're looking for a timeline, because I haven't thought that far ahead. Don't ask me these questions. But it forces you to really think ahead about how you would go about this if you got this money. Like, what would be the steps and when would you do it? And the more detail that you give, the better. That is to say, again, if you have to manufacture something from the timeline, then that's not a good position to be in. So as specific as possible. Again, I find that painful to do sometimes, to do that. Like,
sometimes there's more to your project than you're asking for money for. And if you throw it all into the timeline, it's going to really confuse the panelists. So just be, you're asking for project funding, and your project that you're asking for funding for might not include every single aspect of your whole project. So be selective about what you include in the timeline in that sense. You don't want somebody to read something in the timeline and be like, well, they never mentioned anything in the narrative about that, and how are they going to make that relationship happen, and how much is it going to cost? You don't want them to have that kind of questions.
Yeah. Like sometimes you can choose to specifically apply for just the part that you want funding for. And in that case, you would just do that timeline. Or if you want to help them understand the final iteration, you would be very clear about saying that this is the final iteration, but I'm applying for this, which can be a little bit more difficult, but it's kind of up to you on depending on your project. I've recently applied for something that was $1 million project. And so knowing that no funder is likely going to give you $1 million for one project, You can be specific about saying this is for research and development for this project, but it's important to discuss the final iteration in that case because it is such a big project, and the final iteration and seeing that you're actually working towards that is very important as well.
One more thing, the funding period for the grant.
Yeah.
You need to know when it is and make sure your timeline, this is really basic, but if the funding period for the grant starts, let's say June 1st, 2022, then your project timeline should start June 1st, 2022, not like your exhibition shouldn't happen in May of 2022 because it's not fundable. It's before the funding period begins.
Yeah. And it's usually shared with you in some capacity. Usually they have that in some part of the application. You don't have to like seek it out. So the next question is, sometimes grants ask, why is this a key moment to apply / how will you further your practice? Sometimes it's difficult to articulate beyond the simple reason that you need funding to make a painting series, need financial support. Is there a strategy you could recommend to brainstorm ideas?
Yeah, you can say in that case, that very specific case, you can say for X number of years, I've developed my skills using, let's say, acrylics. And now I want to take a workshop on how to use oil paints. I want to start painting in oil because the colors are different and XYZ. So I need money to get these new materials, different kind of gesso. And you know, it's right there. You just said it. That's going to further your practice by enhancing your skills and letting you make work that is maybe higher quality.
Yeah, that kind of question doesn't always have to. I think sometimes we think that certain questions are expecting like this really big answer, like, you know, and it doesn't always have to be that big answer. Sometimes it is just as straightforward as, I haven't been able to make the amount of work that I'd like to make, and this will allow me to do that. And sometimes it is actually like I'm moving to a completely different medium that I've been fumbling around with, but haven't had the resources to do. But it doesn't always. I think sometimes we think that it needs to be this kind of like, you know, big starburst of a moment, and why we're answering it that way. But it doesn't have to be like that.
I'm just thinking maybe just start with, why are you doing this new project? Because clearly it's revolutionary for you, which is why you're doing this new thing. So that's the flashpoint you want to get across. What is it about this moment with that project that is so important and exciting, that it needs to be done? And just start with those concrete things again. Those are always, I think that one of the most important things about these applications is that specificity again. When you start to maybe feel like I think if you start to feel like you don't know where you're going, go back to your work.
Mm-hmm.
Go back to your work and make everything come out of your work. Like it's there, right? Already.
Yeah, the core of it is the work, you know, and I think that sometimes when you start the writing part of it, we're so entranced with that moment that we forget to like kind of go backwards from time to time and take breaks, you know, like take a break from that writing if you're having a hard time, and revisiting the work, sitting in your studio in silence if you need to, whatever, might bring that stuff back up and remind you why you're working on it. And that's again why I said like sometimes it's nice to like talk to people about it and use that voice typing, and some of those words will just be really helpful as well. So another question we have is, on descriptions of the visual for applications, are we writing primarily to evoke the work for a reader not looking at it, a reader we want to entice to look at it, or a reader looking at the work next to the description / a caption?
That's a great question. If it's a work description, then they see the image and there's a brief description. And what you can do in there is you can say when you made it, what the medium is, what the scale is, and briefly what the context of the work is. So that it was a site-specific project that you were invited to make at XYZ venue. That's good because it shows that you have been commissioned before.
Yeah.
That it is the last work in a series or the first work in a series that you want to develop with this grant. So something that not only it briefly describes what they're looking at, but also ties back into the story of the project that you're working on that shows why you can manage a grant like that, either because you've done a big project to that scale before, or because, yeah, however that fits in.
Yeah.
And just, I mean, I was just thinking about how sometimes you might have uploaded an image or work and that you're describing it, but the person you're jurying may not make the connection between the two. So again, you're on the side of caution when you're describing, and just pretend that they haven't seen that work. I really do think it's better to do that than to assume that they've seen it, and so you don't need to talk about certain things. Putting it in words will help, solidify what you've done visually. So it's never sort of a waste, or a waste of space in some way.
Yeah.
And
I also, oh, sorry.
there's something in art criticism that we're supposed to do, which I think could make sense even for artist statements, which is we're supposed to sort of have equal amounts of description, analysis, and context. And so that means with description, that means really detailed description of your work. Analysis is more your intent, your intent behind using these forms. Why are you using painting, those colors, that kind of thing. And then the context is that you're showing that you're aware that you're part of a larger art world, and you're connecting your practice to other artists. If you can have a healthy balance of those three things, you've accomplished a lot. It's a balance that's difficult for me to do when I'm writing about art. It's not always so easy, but check yourself, go back and see if that's there. It's sometimes you get too into the description, and you don't really talk about your intent behind it, which is not so great. Or you talk about your intent, but then you don't talk about how they're connected to any of the forms. So it has to be that balance, I think, that can really kind of put you in the best light. Like,
Yeah. And it's also really important to note that different readers can engage with different material differently, right? So some people, like, I really love reading the descriptions of the work and reading the project descriptions, but other readers prefer to look at the images. So if for each reader you're answering all their questions with each part of your application, because again, this is why it's called Artist Toolbox 101. It's everything that comes together to tell the story of your work. If you're able to answer the question with the images, you're able to answer the question with the statement, you're able to answer the question with the project descriptions or with the supplemental materials, the budget, everything together, different people will pull the same thing out of it. Then you have a successful application. Oh, we have one more question, which I think could probably be our last one. Could you repeat those three things to have in equal amounts? Oh, yes.
oh, so description, analysis / intent, and context. Those things I mean, that's what I use when I write art criticism. I go back through and see if I have those in a healthy balance. And I never do. So I always have to go back and tweak it.
I mean, it's like the big thing too is like, I think we all can kind of talk about this and be like, oh, do this, do this, do this. But I think everybody has these issues with writing about their work or analyzing work. And so we do all make the same mistakes. And I think that's why we are able to speak to it so well. It happens where you're not doing the greatest thing. I've written things even in the last week where I've sent it to people and they've been like, no. Address everything they ask. Okay, so
Bullet points if you have to, do it for yourself and see how it fits in.
yeah,
Really important. They're asking those questions for a reason, and those reasons might be sort of opaque to you, but they mean something to the asker, and it's a big award that you're going for. And so you want to be as complete as possible with the way that you address their questions.
I'm going to read it out loud because I realized that this question was sent just to the panelists, so the attendees can't see it. But the person asked, when answering a multi-part question in very limited word count, like the Creative Capital application, do you have to address every subsequent prompt? And yes, and as Christy was saying, like, yes, 100%. They're asking it for a reason. It's like the biggest thing that I would pull from that is like, they're asking it for a reason. So for that, you need to be sure to give that context as well as possible. And sometimes it's asked in multiple parts, and there's probably things that you can kind of string together. So it doesn't have to be like you're answering one thing per sentence, but sometimes you can kind of put those sentences together. And, you know, if you do the bullet points like Christy said, you then put it together, count how many words it is, and then if you need to adjust, you adjust from there. But just ensure that you are answering all those questions, because it's very, very obvious when you don't.
They're helping you, they're giving you a formula for how to tell them the information that they want. So it's to your benefit to use that foundation that they've given you that's already lifting you up in terms of helping you organize your ideas.
Yeah, and that's why I say the creative capital application is so great. It does really, really go deep into these questions and gives you a lot of prompts. And I think this, we have one more question. So on citing influences, are we looking for artists / works that feed the applicant's research / generative process, or noting affinities discovered after the work is made? I think it depends on the practice,
Depends on
right?
how to tell the story.
Yeah,
Depends on what the grant is for. It just depends on how you want to shape the story for that particular opportunity.
there's, for something like that, I don't think there's ever going to be one kind of fluid answer that's the same for everyone. I think it's very different per person. Like what influenced the work is going to be different. And I think that just because yours isn't some art historical influence doesn't mean that it's like not as strong as someone else who is using an art historical reference. I think it really just depends on the practice, and it has to be authentic. So don't like find influences because it feels right to say such and such influences my work. Just be realistic and share what actually influences your work. My work is literally just influenced by being an immigrant child, right? Personally. So like talking about what that means, how it relates to my life, my family, whatever, how it forces me to create imagery. It doesn't, it doesn't have to be that I'm influenced by something bigger than that, or like, not bigger, but you know what I mean? Something.
It's like I think Michelle said about just being very authentic and doing what's honest to you. But if you know that you for instance, don't know how to put your work in a context of the art world, find someone that can help you do that. So that maybe you can start thinking about that and whether it makes sense for you. But that's great if you've identified that that's an area maybe you don't know. Maybe you don't know how your work fits into the art world right now. You might need other people to kind of help you. It's like, actually look at this artist, or like there's all this other ecological discourse happening that you're a part of. But going back to the writing and as communication, like all of this is about workshopping, and I think communicating with other people to help you craft these statements as well.
There is another question to the panelists, and maybe I don't know how many more questions we'll take, but I'll
I
read
think we
it.
can make this the last one.
Okay. So influences could be personal in your life and environment, not other artists. I would not say to exclude other artists and movements from your influences, but that it, similar to the project description that we shared, and also similar to what Alpesh stated about that art history should be equal parts description, intent, and context. Your influences should absolutely be connected to art and art history. They might also be connected to social movements like environmentalism. They might also be connected to your personal history as the child of immigrants. But you are going to be competing with people who have really strong connections to art historical movements, and you're working in the context of the arts. And so don't leave that out. That's part of who you are as well.
Yeah. And I think we can wrap it up there. This was really great. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Thank you to all the attendees. Just like housekeeping wise, if you didn't already get the supplemental material, I'll be resharing that later today. And we also have, I mean, I also put it in the chat, but I don't know if you saw that or Danielle put it in the chat for me. And I just wanted to thank Alpesh and Christy for joining me today. It was really great to be able to sit and have this conversation with you all. And we have 3 more sessions. The next one is archiving and documenting your work, which I think is very important because I think that's a thing that we kind of forget that is a necessary part. And then after that, we have building a web presence, and then we have finances and budgeting. So I'm very excited and very thankful to everybody who joined us today and everyone who's going to be continuing. So thank you all.
Thank you, Michelle, for bringing us together.
Of course, it was so great. Bye.
Michelle, and thanks also to Danielle and Esther.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, Christy.